A promise made, a promise broken, and millions of Ukrainians left freezing in the dark. On January 30, 2026, U.S. President Donald Trump announced something that seemed almost impossible. Russian President Vladimir Putin had agreed to halt attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. For 1 week, the relentless bombardment that had plunged Ukraine into darkness would stop. Temperatures were plummeting to minus 30 degrees Celsius. People were dying from the cold. And Putin, apparently moved by Trump's personal appeal, had agreed to show mercy. There was just one problem. Putin's mercy came with an expiration date. And what happened when that date arrived will make your blood boil. Let's rewind to understand how we got here. By January 2026, Ukraine was facing what officials called close to a humanitarian catastrophe. Russia had spent months systematically destroying Ukraine's power grid with waves of missiles and drones. On January 19 alone, Russia launched 373 munitions during extreme cold, with temperatures in some cities dropping to minus 17 degrees Celsius. Millions of Ukrainians were left without heat, electricity, or running water. Hospitals struggled to operate. Families huddled in freezing apartments. The elderly and vulnerable were dying. DTEK, Ukraine's largest private energy company, watched helplessly as its thermal power plants were reduced to rubble. The CEO's words were chilling. Ukraine was teetering on the edge of total collapse. Enter Donald Trump, and the newly inaugurated president had made ending the war in Ukraine one of his top priorities. He'd promised to broker peace within days of taking office. That hadn't happened. But on January 29, Trump picked up the phone and called Putin directly. His request was simple. Stop attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure, just for a week. Give people a chance to survive the brutal cold snap that meteorologists were predicting would only get worse. And Putin agreed. On January 30, Trump announced the deal to the world. A temporary halt on energy strikes until February 1st. It wasn't a full ceasefire. Russian forces would continue their military operations, continue shelling the front lines, continue their grinding war of attrition. But for 1 week, Ukraine's power plants, heating facilities, and electrical grids would be spared. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky cautiously welcomed the news, calling it an opportunity rather than a formal agreement. Ukraine, in turn, agreed to pause its own strikes on Russian energy assets, the oil refineries and fuel depots that had been funding Putin's war machine. It was reciprocal. It was limited. But it was something. For 6 days, Putin kept his word. The attacks on energy infrastructure stopped. Ukrainians dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the first step towards something bigger. Peace talks were scheduled for February 4 and 5 in Abu Dhabi. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, along with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and even Jared Kushner, would sit down with Russian and Ukrainian negotiators to hammer out a deal. Then February 3 arrived. Just 2 days after the temporary halt expired, Russia unleashed hell. In what military analysts are calling the most devastating attack of 2026, Putin's forces launched over 500 missiles and drones at Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Not 50, not 100, over 500. The barrage included more than 70 missiles, 32 of them ballistic Iskanders, and 450 drones, so aimed at power plants, heating facilities, and electrical distribution systems across 8 regions. In Kyiv, 2 of the city's 3 power stations were destroyed. A boiler house was obliterated. High-rise apartment buildings were damaged. 3 people were injured. Emergency blackouts hit entire districts, leaving hundreds of thousands without power in temperatures hovering around minus 20 degrees Celsius. But in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, Energy infrastructure was hammered so badly that authorities had to drain water from the heating systems of 820 buildings to prevent pipes from bursting. 2 civilians were injured. All 101 emergency shelters, Ukraine calls them points of invincibility, were activated to provide warmth and charging stations for desperate residents. Odessa, Dnipro, and other cities faced similar devastation. Kyiv's thermal plants, already crippled by months of attacks, suffered severe damage. Thousands more Ukrainians were plunged into darkness. The humanitarian catastrophe that had been temporarily paused was now back with a vengeance. Trump's reaction? Putin kept his word. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Trump defended the Russian president, or noting that the truce was for Sunday to Sunday, and that once the week ended, it opened up and he hit them hard. Trump added, almost dismissively, "1 week is a lot. We will take anything." Let that sink in. Putin had just launched the most powerful attack of the year on civilian infrastructure, leaving millions freezing in sub-zero temperatures. And Trump's response was essentially, well, he did what he said he would. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt doubled down, saying Trump was unsurprised by the attack and blaming the war's start on prior U.S. leadership weakness. The message was clear. This was business as usual, and America wasn't going to hold Putin accountable. Zelensky, meanwhile, was furious. He called on Trump to respond, pointing out that the massive attack came just 1 day before the Abu Dhabi peace talks were set to begin. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was calculated. Putin was sending a message. I'll negotiate, but only from a position of overwhelming strength. And this brings us to the real story behind Putin's so-called agreement. Because the temporary energy halt was never about mercy or humanitarian concern. It was a tactical maneuver designed to make Putin look reasonable while changing absolutely nothing about his ultimate demands. Throughout January, even as Trump's team worked frantically to broker peace, Putin's conditions remained unchanged. Ukraine must withdraw from all territories Russia claims, including areas Russia doesn't even control. Ukraine must abandon any hope of joining NATO. Our Ukraine must accept permanent neutrality, which in Putin's vocabulary means becoming a Russian vassal state. Ukraine must recognize Russian control over Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. These aren't negotiating positions. They're ultimatums. The Trump administration's 28-point peace plan, presented to Zelensky in early February, reads like a wish list written in the Kremlin. Ukraine must cap the size of its military. Ukraine cannot join NATO. Ukraine must cede parts of Donetsk it currently controls, roughly 2,500 square miles, creating a demilitarized buffer zone that would be recognized as Russian territory. In exchange, Ukraine gets vague security guarantees and promises of a reconstruction fund. But here's the kicker. Russia has already violated every agreement it's ever made with Ukraine, from the 1994 Budapest Memorandum to the 2015 Minsk Accords. Why would this time be any different? It wouldn't, and Putin knows it. On January 28 and 29, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio claimed that control of Donetsk Oblast was the only unresolved issue in negotiations. Within hours, Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov appeared on state television to dispute this, insisting that Russia's demands were far broader and non-negotiable. The poly-market prediction market on a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire by January 31, 2026, resolved as no. No mutual public announcement, no halt in fighting, no breakthrough, just more stalling, more contradictory statements, and more Ukrainian civilian suffering. And here lies the great irony of Putin's agreement. By accepting a one-week pause on energy strikes, Putin got exactly what he wanted. He looked like a reasonable leader willing to compromise. He gave Trump a win to tout to his base, and he bought himself time to prepare an even more devastating attack. The February 3 barrage wasn't just revenge for the pause. It was a demonstration of power timed perfectly to coincide with the Abu Dhabi talks. The message to Ukraine was unmistakable. You can negotiate all you want. You can appeal to Trump. You can hope for peace. But I will continue to destroy you until you accept my terms. The message to Trump was equally clear. Your influence over me is limited. I'll give you symbolic gestures when it suits me, but don't mistake that for weakness. And the message to the world? Putin doesn't do ceasefires. He does tactical pauses that serve his strategic interests. As Ukrainians endure hourly power outage schedules, as families burn furniture to stay warm, as hospitals operate by candlelight, Putin sits in the Kremlin, calculating his next move. The Abu Dhabi talks may produce more headlines, more progress, more reasons for optimism. But unless Ukraine agrees to surrender its sovereignty, its territory, and its future, Putin will keep launching missiles. The temporary energy halt wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a preview of the peace Putin envisions. One where he controls when Ukrainians have heat and light. Where he decides when the suffering stops and starts. Where Ukraine exists only at Russia's pleasure. Trump may be satisfied with 1 week of reduced attacks. But for the millions of Ukrainians shivering in the dark, Putin's agreement was just another broken promise in a war built on lies.